Good day to everybody, wherever you are. We are pleased to have you all here today. My name is Ottaviano Canuto, and I'm a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Institute. I'm also a former vice president and executive director at the World Bank and executive director at the IMF. Well, commodity prices have been rising since last year. The energy prices have particularly felt the impact of ongoing geopolitical events, including what happened since yesterday. But energy, food, and metals have all moved up as compared to pre-pandemic levels. Why? What are the implications from such moves? Will they have implications for the transition to a zero-carbon economy? What is the outlook? So we, the Policy Center for the New South, in collaboration with the World Bank, have organized this panel to discuss those questions. And what a team we have here today. We will start by a presentation by John Bass, a senior agricultural economist with the World Bank's Prospects Group. He heads the commodities unit and is in charge of the commodity markets outlook. John will initially speak to us about developments and outlook of commodity markets. And also as discussants, we have Uri Dadouche, who's also a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and a non-resident scholar at Brookings. His illustrious career included a time at the World Bank as director of the International Trade, Economic Policy, and Development Prospects Department. Uri, John, and I have in common the World Bank in our trajectories. Marie-Louise Djibenu-Kre is an economist researcher at the Central Bank of West African States and a professor at the West African Center for Banking Education and Studies and at Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar. She was previously an economist at the Bank of France. Jiang Yang is JP Morgan Endowed Chair and Research Director at JP Morgan Center for Commodities and also founding director of Center for China Financial Research at the University of Colorado, Denver. He's also a research fellow of the National Institute of Financial Research at Tsinghua University in China. At the page of the event, you can find more of their biographies. After John, Uri, Marie-Louise, and Jiang, we open for questions and cross comments. Thank you indeed. John?
Thank you, Daviano, and also great thanks to the Policy Center of the New South for inviting me to have that presentation, and also for putting together such a great panel, including, as you said, Daviano, Uri, yourself, who spent quite a bit of time in the World Bank, as well as Jian from Colorado, who is a commodity expert. This is going to offer a lot of insights in our discussion, as well as Marie-Louise, who will presumably hear the macro perspective from commodity markets. Let me first try to upload to show my presentation, and then okay, is my presentation showing the screen? Great, thank you. Today's presentation, I'm going to talk about commodity markets outlook. I will begin by giving you a summary of developments in the outlook, including our recent outlook on the global economy. I'll talk a bit about commodity price trends, and then in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to zoom in a bit more detail on the three main commodity markets: energy, metals, and agriculture. And at the end, I will wrap up with some risks to this outlook and forecast, which, as we all understand, changed quite a bit during the past 24 hours. Before I start the presentation, I get deeper into the commodity markets, let me just give you a summary of the outlook and the recent developments. In terms of price movements, Again, crude oil prices, here I'm showing what I was writing yesterday evening, which was $90 per barrel, but we all know that today the price of oil has exceeded $100 per barrel, reflecting basically strong demand, low inventories, and geopolitical issues. Natural gas prices and coal prices have also fluctuated around historical highs, and in some occasions they have even exceeded the 2010 and 2011 price records. Metal prices have strengthened as well, basically reflecting strong demand, especially by China, as well as some supply chain disruption and issues. And lastly, food prices, they also have hit near or record 10-year highs. And in the terms of food prices, the key reasons are high input costs, although in some respects, in some food markets, we do have well-supplied conditions, especially compared to what we experienced in the earlier price spikes of 2011 and 2007. What caused the recent price spikes? Of course, we have a stronger demand, especially for industrial commodities, a number of adverse weather, which this time affected not only agricultural commodities, but they also affected the demand and supply of energy. And of course, we had the supply chain issues that were unfolding, that are still unfolding due to the COVID-19 pandemic. What is at stake? In general, high prices are fueling inflation. They could slow down growth, especially in energy and food imported emerging markets and developing economies. And for low-income countries, they could exacerbate food insecurity. What is the outlook and the risk as we move forward? Certainly prices are going to average much, much higher than 2021 and of course than 2020. In terms of risks, adverse weather and supply constraints used to be important risks. But now geopolitical developments, I would say, have overtaken the risk, so to speak, domain of commodity markets. So let me just give you a glimpse of what our thoughts about the global economic growth prospects. And the chart I'm showing you reflects the recent edition of the global economic prospects. In fact, this is the January 22 edition. We can see here the relative stability of growth between 2016 and 2019, the huge negative shock during the pandemic of 2020. And for 2021, our outlook is 5.5% growth, the year that just ended. And for 2022, we have a 4.1% global growth. Just to compare those numbers with what we reported back in June of 2021, those are very minor downward revisions, again, compared to June 2021, about, I believe, 0.2% downward revision. So the big picture basically has, or at least had not changed in January 2022 when we reported those results compared to what we thought the outlook would be during 2021. Again, just a very marginal downward revision, which for commodity markets really does matter a lot. We do expect a further slowdown for 2023 to 3.2%. But again, those forecasts, as I said, have been finalized for our January global economic prospects report. We have a lot of downside risks with recent events, so presumably those forecasts to go down considerably in our subsequent editions. Lastly, one other item that I want to highlight, when we analyze commodity markets, we always like to distinguish between growth in advanced economies and growth in emerging market and developing economies. And the reason is that commodity markets are being influenced considerably more by developments in the emerging market and developing economies than they do in advanced economies, simply because most of the production, consumption, and trade takes place within EMDs, and that's why we like to have this distinction between those two groups of countries. Now, let me move to price developments, and I'm taking a bit of a longer term view here, including the shaded area which shows the pandemic. period, we see during the pandemic period a huge decline in prices, especially energy prices, because of the pandemic. But we also saw a very sharp recovery. And today, most prices are either at levels that we had experienced back in the period during 2010-2012, or on some occasions, prices are even much higher than those levels. In terms of oil prices, right now oil prices are fluctuating above $100 per barrel. They averaged about $115 per barrel during 2010, during 2014. So we have not reached that level yet. And if we take into account inflation, I would say that oil prices now are about 15% lower in real terms than they had been prior to the collapse of 2014. We also have seen a huge recovery, very strong recovery in metals and agricultural prices. Metal prices, of course, responding to the recovery of the global economy. And agricultural prices increased a lot, despite the fact that most agricultural markets or most food markets are, I would say, are well supplied. Just not lose sight of the longer term of the other commodity markets. I'm showing you this chart in addition to oil, the prices of natural gas and coal. You can see in the chart to the right, and there you can see the huge spike that took place in those two markets, and those commodities are by far, the price rather of those commodities are by far much higher than they had been during 2010 through 2012 during those spikes. And that's also another issue that I would like to highlight, is the fact that when we are talking about commodity energy spikes today, and we compare it to the earlier spike in the about 10 years ago, the key difference today is that we have spikes across all three commodity markets, energy commodity markets, crude oil, natural gas, and coal, as opposed to back then when it was only oil that was driving the spike in energy prices. Not to lose perspective from a longer term, I'm showing you here the prices of oil throughout the past half century, since 1970. The average since then, to the extent that the average is a meaningful metric, is $56 per barrel. And the highest in real terms we experienced was in 2007 spike, when in today's terms the price of oil was back then around $150 per barrel. And again, let's keep in mind that those are real prices in today's terms. So the $105 of oil that we're seeing now compares to about $150 that we experienced back in 2010 through 2012, or rather, I'm sorry, in 2007 and 2008. What has caused the uptick, the spike in oil prices? Well, one issue was strong demand, which I mentioned early on, rather stronger than expected demand through the strong rebound to the global economy. But we also have developments on the supply side, and the key development on the supply side was the fact that this time producers, both OPEC and OPEC Plus, as well as other producers, exercised, I would say, very disciplined restraint. And to the chart of the left, we're comparing oil supplies, or rather how much oil supply grew compared to a baseline of January 2020, which was the month prior to the emergence of the pandemic. And we do see that compared to that month, supplies today are lower by all three groups that I mentioned, and have been lower throughout the entire period. So the chart on the left basically shows us what I said earlier, that all oil suppliers, which includes OPEC, OPEC Plus, as well as others, they have exercised very disciplined, so behavior, shall we say. To the right, we also see oil production by the United States. And what is also surprising in the United States, against our expectations, is the fact that we expected the shale oil would respond much quicker, but it did not. Shale oil in the United States did not respond as supply growth as we thought. And there are 2 or 3 reasons behind that sort of behavior. The first is that comparing the structure of the shale oil industry in the United States now with its structure, let's say 5 or 10 years ago, today a lot of the industry is owned by major oil companies who, so to speak, respond to shareholders. So they are not as much interested in promoting or expanding production as they are interested in ensuring returns to shareholders. So that's one reason why you see so limited response by the US shale oil industry. The second reason is that the banks in the United States they are not as generous in financing new oil supplies, expansion of oil supplies in the US, because a lot of US shale oil companies went out of business, so the banks are exercising very cautious. They are very cautiously on how and when to finance the US shale oil industry. So those are the 2 key reasons as to why we did not see much response from the United States. Now, just moving to the other energy commodity markets, just to give you a glimpse of what is happening there. To the left, we see the natural gas inventories in Europe. And the red line shows us those inventories in 2021. And we see that those inventories are low by any historical standards, whether we take the 2020 average or whether 2020 levels, or whether we look at the 2016 or 2020 range. So inventories in Europe and elsewhere in the world for natural gas are at dangerously low levels. And the same issue pretty much applies for inventories, for oil inventories. And to the right, we see a chart with oil inventories in OECD countries, and we do see there that in 2021, the oil inventories in OECD countries are fluctuating at levels that are on the lower range when we compare it to the last 10-year average. So moving now to what is unfolding in the metals market. To the left, we see the increase or the rebound in metal prices, which increased by more than 50% between the lows of the early stage of the pandemic until recently. And for the most part, metal prices, not for the most part, I would even say almost exclusively, metal prices respond to the global economic activity. And here I'm comparing metal price index with the global manufacturing Purchasing Manager Index, and you can clearly see how closely each other move. So when you have a rebound in global manufacturing, metal prices would always follow suit quickly. To the right, I'm separating the metal prices into 2 groups: the base metal prices index, which contains aluminum, copper, zinc, etc., versus the iron ore. And you can see that the iron ore, there was a huge drop in prices later the last year, and that was exclusively a response to the fact that steel production in China declined sharply, because almost all iron ore goes to the manufacturing of steel production. In terms of a bit of a longer-term perspective, just to set the scene for metal prices, or rather global metal consumption. In the chart to the left, we see the dominant position that China plays in global metal markets, especially on the consumption side. We see that if we compare today with 1995, let's say, in 1995, China accounted for only 5% of global metal consumption. Today, China accounts for nearly 55% of global metal consumption, and we see that for the rest of the world, that includes both EMDs and advanced economies, this share, or rather the level of consumption of global for metals, has remained pretty much the same. So the bottom line in metals is that metals prices and consumption patterns is pretty much a China story. When China does well, especially in terms of industrial activity and the real estate sector, and the exports, metal prices go up. When China is not doing well, metal prices go down. And to the right, just to summarize the global metal market, we see the year-to-year growth on metal demand during the pandemic. And what we see here is that in the red bars, which represent China demand kept its pace during the pandemic. We see that it was always on positive territory throughout the pandemic, or mostly in positive territory. What was interesting during the pandemic is that metals demand declined a lot from non-China, both OECD countries as well as other non-OECD countries. And we saw that decline during the early stages of the pandemic, and also the recovery that took place during the past 10 to 12 months, which is consistent with the rebound, sharper than expected rebound in the global economy that I showed you earlier in the presentation. Just very little on precious metals prices, how they moved and what are the reasons behind it. Gold, of course, during the pandemic increased for obvious reasons. When the times are bad, people look at gold as an investment vehicle. So this is not surprising. What's interesting, though, to me at least, is the behavior of platinum prices, which in some respects it's a precious metal commodity, but it's also an industrial commodity. And what we see in platinum, we see a huge decline in the early stages of the pandemic, a sharp increase, and the decline afterwards. And that pretty much is explained by the behavior of the global car manufacturing, the global auto industry, because half of platinum goes to the production of goes into the production of cars for emission purposes. So when the car industry was hit by the microchip shortage and production of cars went down, platinum price also went down. They were followed by some recovery, and then now they are down again. So there are some commodities, two of them at least important. One is platinum and the other is natural rubber, which follow very closely what's going on in the global manufacturing, the global car industry, the global auto industry. When this industry is doing well, those commodity prices go up. When this industry is not doing that well, we see the downward trends. Now, in terms of gold, taking a longer term perspective, and we see that in the chart to the right, what is interesting is that although in the shorter term, gold price is affected by geopolitical events and flight to safe havens, etc., when we take a longer term perspective, we see this match between gold prices and interest rates, this inverse relationship. Basically, in the longer term, if one excludes short-term fluctuation, gold prices pretty much follow interest rates. Interest rates go down, people go to gold. Investors rather go to gold. Interest rates go up, the reverse move takes place. And of course, as now we're approaching, or we're entering an era where central banks are going to sort of making finance tighter, financial conditions tighter, interest rates are likely to go up, it's likely that we're going to see gold prices going down. Lastly, I'm going to talk a bit about agricultural prices. We separate agricultural prices into three sort of subgroupings. One is food, which is a broad index and includes grains and oilseeds such as maize and the soybeans and the rice. We have raw materials, which is pretty much a few industrial commodities such as cotton and natural rubber. And we have beverages, which is actually the beverage, coffee, tea, and cocoa. And we see during the pandemic three trends. One trend, relative stability in raw materials. Another, so to speak, trend in beverages, which is pretty much explained by the spike in coffee prices due to production issues in Brazil. But more importantly, we see this upward trend in food prices, which, as I said earlier, by now they have reached levels experienced in 2012 in nominal terms and about 10 to 15% lower in real terms. And that's the big surprise and also the big risk for food importing countries and food price inflation. And that's a bit surprising, but let me elaborate on this before I conclude my presentation. In this chart, we see global food supply growth for grains and edible oils. The red line shows the global, the long-term average for the past 30 years on global food supply. So how much they grew on average throughout this 30-year period. And the bars indicate how much it grew each year. And of course, the last bar indicates how much growth we expect this year for the season that ends in August of this year. And we see two basically we have two takeaway points from this chart. First, that this year's supplies are pretty much on very close to the long-term average. So that's one message. And the second message is that the second takeaway is that we have seen some tightness in the past 4 to 5 years for grains, in the past 3 years for edible oils, but in some respects that tightness is expected because we had good supplies in the years prior to that. So when you have years of good supplies, stock levels are replenished, so you have less of a supply response in the subsequent years. So looking at this chart, I would say that food commodity markets behave in a expected or normal, so to speak, manner, and that would justify the spikes that we have experienced recently. At least that would have been my take. Another way to look at the global food supply and demand conditions is to use the metric that we typically use in agricultural commodity markets, which is the so-called stock-to-use ratio, which basically looks at the inventories at the end of the season in comparison to the expected consumption at the end of the season. And this is a number that fluctuates between, let's say, 20 or 30%, or sometimes 40%, depending on the commodity. And basically that metric shows us how well supplied markets are compared to expectations about demand. Today's this ratio, which I have combined for 12 food commodities based on calorific weights, today this ratio is at 28%. This is the last column I'm showing you this chart. This is a little lower than the record we experienced in 2018. And this decline for 31 to 28% is consistent with what I showed you earlier, that we have some tightness in the market, but not major downward revisions. Now, if we compare to what unfolded back during the 2020, from 2020 through 2006, the picture is a little different. We also have had a high ratio of aggregate stocks to use ratio of 31% in 2020, but in 2006, that ratio was down to 17%. The takeaway from this chart is that today, the global food supply, the global food markets are much better supplied than what they were back in the spikes 2007 and 2011 and 2012, which of course poses the question why then food prices have experienced such a spike. And the answer comes from what we see in the chart to the left. As I said earlier, coal prices and natural gas prices have skyrocketed. That has caused fertilizer prices to skyrocket. We see here that some fertilizer prices, they have reached record high levels. So in other words, The spike in energy prices has affected a lot the agricultural sector, the agricultural industry, especially food prices. And again, at least from my perspective, it's not very surprising because the agricultural sector is very energy intensive sector. It's affected directly by fuels, indirectly by fertilizers, because some of the fertilizers are made from natural gas and coal in the case of China. They are bulky commodities. To store and transport them, you need a lot of energy. And that's, in my opinion, at least why we see the spike in food prices. While we have, so to speak, supply and demand conditions are much more reasonable or less tight than when they were back in the spikes of 2010 and 2012, it's the energy prices that they have affected a lot of food prices. Lastly, one word on biofuel production, and of course, I would like to end my presentation by just outlining the risks in commodity markets. In agricultural markets, in food markets, we have, and let me move to the next slide. I'm starting from the bottom since I'm talking about agricultural markets. In food markets, the agricultural markets, we have three main risks. The most important risk is geopolitical developments. Because of what unfolded in Central Asia now, we have the issue of grain supplies. Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan are important exporters of grains such as wheat and maize. And then, of course, those countries are important suppliers of energy, and also they are important suppliers of fertilizers. And also you have the trade, sort of the transportation routes that originate from that area. So if I have to rank which group of commodities may be affected the most by the recent geopolitical developments, I would put agricultural food commodities on the top. Then we have the energy risks in the energy markets. We did not see, as expected, much response from the shale oil industry. That surprised us. OPEC plus cohesion also surprised us. We thought that OPEC plus would not be able to exercise such restraint continues for almost 2 years now. And of course, the biggest issue is the geopolitical developments. Now, in metals, the picture there is a bit different in the sense that metals are affected a lot by demand conditions, much more than other groups such as agriculture, even energy. And metals, as I said, is dominated by China. If the global growth outlook continues to be the same, we could see an increase or stability in the metal markets. However, if the global outlook deteriorates, especially the global outlook of China, then we could see a decline in metal prices. And then lastly, just one word about energy transition. All three commodity groups are affected a lot by the energy transition. Agriculture through biofuels. A lot of countries have announced ambitious goals for the diversion of food commodities biofuels in the face of the ongoing energy transition. Typically, announcements differ a lot when compared to actual policy actions, but if those announcements materialize, even if a portion of those announcements materialize, we could see a further upward pressures on food commodity prices because of biofuels. And comparing energy and metals in terms of long-term growth prospects, of course, energy, we're going to see less fossil fuel use in the longer term because of the energy transition, but we're going to see more metals use, again, due to the energy transition, because a lot of metals are used in renewables energy storage. And at that, I would like to end my presentation just to let you know that all the aspects of my presentation, including the commodity markets outlook, prices, and the number of blogs that are published on a regular basis, are posted in our web and are publicly available. And since I have the floor, I would like to make one announcement that our commodities unit is putting together a volume on developments, historical developments, prospects of commodity markets. It's a volume quite large, close to 250 pages, and we are going to launch this volume either on March 16 or on March 17th. So please watch, and I will be glad to engage and perhaps give another presentation on that volume. With that note, I will end my presentation and hand the floor back to Daviano.
All right. Thank you, John. And we're looking forward to this new report. Let me call in Uri so that he can make his comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I found John's presentation as usual, and the report that I read, I confess I read mainly the executive summary. I expected to go into greater depth, but then Russia invaded Ukraine, and we're trying to deal with a lot of things at the same time. I found the presentation very cogent, and the explanation of the common forces and then the very idiosyncratic situations in each of the commodity markets to be balanced and perfectly logical. I'm not looking at these issues closely enough now to say I'm going to disagree on the overall thrust of the forecast that is put forward, but I have a number of questions which I'd like to put, and then leave time to others who are more expert than I. The first and obviously most pressing question now is, John, do you have a view? I'm sure you do, but what is your view on how the conflict in Ukraine will affect the areas of risk that you already highlighted? Okay, particularly in the case of energy, gas prices and oil prices, etc., and food prices. How do you see that situation, and can I encourage you to say something about the short term? Yeah, I am assuming that the war will be a relatively short one. The really open bad hostilities, that's the general assumption on people who know the situation, that however valiant the resistance of Ukraine armed forces might be, they are confronted with overwhelming odds. And so typically those kinds of wars we've seen again and again in history tend to be very bloody and very short. And so I'd be interested in your view on the short-term outlook, yeah? But also, what does it look like in the long term, in a situation where you have prolonged sanctions, and are they likely to extend to food exports, cereal exports? Are they likely to extend in the long term to gas exports? When I say long term, I don't mean 30 years. I mean the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I'd be very interested in that. The second question that the presentation raises for me is with the high food prices and the risk associated with these food prices, and I read your Global Economic Prospects report that I used to run for many years, and which has improved a lot since I left. You stress quite a lot there the issue of inequality, and correctly so, the unequal impact of the pandemic. And the question here is, if we have higher food prices, especially given the conflict in Ukraine, and these extend for a period of time, which countries will be most affected, and what are the effects on within country inequality as well as outside inter-country inequality. And if that's not enough for you, I have a third question, which is we have witnessed a remarkable acceleration in inflation, and all sorts of reasons have been put forward for the acceleration of inflation. I'd be very interested in your view on the extent to which commodity markets have been subject to similar forces, and the extent to which commodity markets themselves have been a big contributor to the acceleration of inflation. So those are three questions which I hope you can discuss, and I hope the other very expert people, including Ottaviano, who has an easy job today, can comment on.
All right, Judith, thank you. Let's pass over to Marie-Louise. Marie-Louise, please give your take.
Thank you, Ottaviano. I think that my presentation is very in the same way as the comments of Yuri. I think that I will just illustrate a little bit what he said, but I think it's the same, on the same way. Okay, I can share my screen.
Yes, yes, yeah.
It's okay. Okay, doesn't matter. I can show it here. It's cool.
Maybe they have authorized.
Great, it's okay now.
Okay.
Yes. I think it's worked now. Okay, thank you. So as I'm saying, I'm Marie-Lise Jibenu-Mukre. I'm a researcher at the Central Bank of West African States, and I'm very honored to participate to this webinar on commodity market outlook that John presents. And I really appreciate this presentation. And it was very, very interesting. I think that I've already put in my presentation most of the point that you also include in your presentation. So it will be just question about the equilibriums. Probably as I'm a macroeconomist, I'm more focused on equilibriums and the point and the shocks that we could observe now and for the next period. So just have a look on the dynamics of commodity prices indexes, but just have a look on the different periods of the monthly observation of what we had. We can observe that for most commodity markets, energy, agriculture, metals and minerals, and in some instances for precious metals, we consider that the price that we have now is far from the price that we have before the crisis, just before the COVID crisis. Especially for agriculture, we have that a price, we can consider that the price is at least around 20%, much more than the price that we had in September at the same period in 2020. And recently, as you say, the energy market is raising sharply, and we have the same observation for the others. Okay, we have a slowly decline of precious metals that we can also observe here. From the constat of this observation, we could also say that in this new and hopefully situation when we have a recovery, a global recovery concerning the crisis, the health crisis, we could have some figures here that show that all over the world, we have a recovery. We could observe that, especially for daily, I've calculated the daily average of new cases and the daily average of new deaths by region. And we can observe that the daily new case is increasing, but we observe also that we have a decrease of the daily new deaths. So that means that the recovery is efficient, is concern all the different regions throughout the world. Also, another good news, which is relevant with this recovery, would be, would also be the return of economic growth, and also for advanced economies, as you showed, and for emerging and developing countries. So the question that I had will concern principally the multiple equilibriums hypothesis, because when we consider the real risk that you also showed, and we also see in the paper, in the report, we have climatic disruption, droughts, higher temperature, flood. We also have and we can see today also the political risks and conflicts, and also the pressure on the prices on energy product and inflation pressure. This risk, this real risk, and also without forgetting the rational expectation that we have also to consider for analyzing and for forecasting on market. I would ask the question about equilibrium, because you also said, and I agree, I totally agree with this point, that any shock can have a positive and a negative effect on demand and supply at the same time, according to the canals that we consider. But currently, we also have the situation where we have many shocks that I can say clashing together. I find an expression in French, but I cannot translate it properly in English, saying shock contre shock. But in English, it would be just a clashing shocks. But we have many risks that going together. And according to the probability that one is occurrent or not, we have many canals which interact together. So for me, we are going to conditioned equilibrium. But I put an S in brackets, and my question would be in this way: what is your point of view about the different equilibriums that we could expect, and probably we could? What is your point of view about probably more volatility, according to the first question? And if you consider that we are entering in a new super cycle, because I remember in last June we had a discussion about the new if we are entering in a super cycle. But your point of view, what is your point of view about this question? Thank you, John.
Great, Marie-Louise. Thank you. Let me hand over to Gian. After macro, now we're going to come with finance, I bet.
Hello, everyone. This is Gian. Greetings from Colorado, US. Let me try to share my screen here. Can you all see that? Let me see. Oh, let me make this a full screen. Yeah. John's presentation is very informative, giving us a lot of information how we can think about those the movement of commodity prices in the future. And I particularly like a lot of things he mentioned, like the important role of energy transition, which would as he mentioned in the last one or two slides, those kind of things affecting those commodity price movement in the future. But my discussion here about his presentation actually is in line with what Ms. Marie Lewis just mentioned. Actually, something related to the commodity cycle, because only when we understand, how those individual commodity cycles, they might interact with each other, we get a better clue about, things happening, say, in energy due to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, those kind of things, might be spread over to other commodities, say, may affect agricultural commodities in the future. A lot of things mainly happen about energy, those kind of things. That would be my discussion on John's presentation here. But one thing we need to understand is commodity price cycles really are very highly synchronized. This is very essential to a lot of important debates, including those how those emerging market business cycles may be synchronized, those kind of things. That's even something some people in the US, they talk about the financialization of commodities, all those kind of things. And actually the global economic prospect just published last month by the World Bank. They have devoted one chapter to show that individual commodities, under their analysis, which is about 40, were in the same cyclical phase 60% of time, just in the last 5 decades. That's very significant in terms of those coincidence of this kind of commodity cycles, across different commodities. But one thing people do not know enough is that this kind of synchronization actually has a huge economic significance. It's really striking. When we eyeball those kind of the commodity price chart, sometimes we may think, it's easy to see they may move together. That's not fact, because the research earlier already shows that as the price change correlation across those major commodities actually are not high, actually pretty low in recent years, from 2004 to 2014. But that's their synchronization. A lot of things actually is mainly due to those volatility, commodity price volatility interaction. And my own research actually find that based on 25 major commodity futures prices from 2006 to 2019, we find that on average, each of these 25 major commodities markets during this sample period, 40% of their volatility come from other commodities, not due to their own shock. And actually, this kind of percentage can be as low as 31% over time during the sample period, but can be as high as 63%. That's 63% is really striking, and which occurred actually during crisis time, like 2008, 2009. And in that case, we look at further about, how those commodities may play a role in this kind of network of this kind of commodity cycle or commodity volatility cycle. We find the same set of commodities. They play the most active role in sending and receiving volatility shocks. We do not find that before we thought, maybe we have some certain set of commodities. They probably particularly important in sending those volatility shocks affecting others. Then we have another group, another set of commodities, which probably will be particularly vulnerable to the volatility shocks there. But we don't find those we find the same set, a commodity play this kind of role. And at the individual commodity level, we find the two commodities, which is not really surprising. We find that crude oil and soybeans, are most influential. And definitely everyone understands the importance of crude oil. And soybeans, that one during that sample period, it's easy to see that this is mainly due to the biofuel, the production. And another thing which really confirm our finding, this kind of thing is that we find the traditional commodity groupings, for example, we say this grain, this is this egg, all those kind of things, livestock, those kind of things, they are in general quite accurate, meaning that those commodities traditionally considered belonging to a group, they have very similar or quite comparable characteristics in this kind of network there. Very interesting, but there are some notable exceptions. And for example, we find that natural gas behaves very differently from the crude oils during the sample period, which means that we need to pay more attention to, say, when we consider what things might happen to heating oil by looking at the crude oil. But when we look at natural gas, they probably it will be somewhat different. And not surprising that we find energy as a category indeed is most influential in affecting all other two, like metal and egg, those categories. But within this agricultural commodity category, the grain is very influential. Probably it's due to those certain grain futures, certain grain commodities are tied to this biofuel production, but livestock and softs, they are among the least influential in affecting other commodities. Seems that it's better not to treat the egg commodities as a homogeneous group. They are not. By looking at their roles they may play in this network of commodity volatility network. And we also find that it's important to realize that this kind of interaction among commodities, they may be different depending on the time horizon we look at this. We find that the volatility spill over from 1 month to 1 year actually indeed is significantly explained by the US broad economic conditions, which we use as a proxy for global economic conditions. And surprisingly, not too much affected by the financial market conditions, just I say for overall, not just in terms of certain individual commodities. But if we look at the short-term, this volatility spill over across commodities, like I say, within a week, we do not find any connection with this these broad economic conditions. We find that there are some important implications when we look at this each commodity's movement. Or the outlook. We find that based on this kind of finding, we should treat in some sense the commodity as broad as a class. At least from this commodity volatility spill over there, it's important to treat them as broad as a class. And that's for all those specialists, commodity specialists on a particular commodity, they cannot just only focus on the things happening within that particular commodity. They actually need to watch for the market situation or volatility in other commodities. In short term, they focus on the commodities in the same group. But in long term, they also need to watch for the things happening in other groups, particularly like soybeans, crude oil there. And a lot of people think, there's a lot of speculation driving commodity markets there, which is probably true. But however, we find that actually still the broad macroeconomic fundamental really matters for commodities. That's my discussion. Thank you.
All right, Jan. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I hand over back to John, besides, of course, the very hot 3 questions that Woody made to you, we also had from Marie-Louise using the framework of multiple equilibriums to highlight the relevance of simultaneously discussions about a super cycle or differentiated super cycles, if any, among commodities. And that fit quite well with John mentioning that you have synchronization, but at the same time, the energy is the most influential component in this synchronization among commodity price. And that fits well with the chapter, in my view, of the global economic prospects on the commodity price cycles, calling attention to the presence of common global factors being particularly relevant in the case of energy. It called my attention in the global economic prospect chapter, the downward ranking of global impacts. And John, even before the latest developments in Ukraine now, in Russia and Europe, we saw last year how the climate transition might have to cope with the fact that while on the one hand we have the increasing demand and the prospects of a rising demand for metals, particularly the rare metal and so on, even though one might guess that as the climate transition evolves, the demand for fossil fuels will decrease and so on, but the supply restrictions, as you so well brought in your presentation, including on the shale oil and gas here in the US, and also the decision by prospective oil exporters to retain from increasing production, has led to energy price shocks last year. So to what extent would you say that might run against the change in relative price that we all want in order to have the energy transition forward? So it's a great discussions, a great presentation that we made. Let me hand it over to you so that you can give us back your take. And then we might have some time for any other additional comment by the discussants. Come in, John. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ottaviano. What can I say? Uri started with his tough questions, 3 of them. Marie-Louise followed up. She built even more, Gian even more. And Ottaviano added the energy transition as the icing in the cake, so to speak. Good points, good questions. Let me just take a few minutes and summarize my views. The first question, Uri's question on the short, medium term, so to speak, outlook, especially in what in the recent developments in Ukraine and Russia, and also Marie-Louise's question about whether we are in the early stages of a new super cycle, and also Gian's point of this movement and synchronization across commodity markets. Let me try to summarize my views on this as much as I can. Let me start by saying what is different now with what unfolded, let's say, 10 years ago, and there are 3 issues that are different now. The first is that what we saw now was increases in coal and natural gas prices. Those are the prices that led the way beyond, even before the recent developments that unfolded in Central Asia. That's different. Now, why did those prices increase so much and so fast? You have the short-term considerations, weather issues that affected the hydroelectricity production, and the wind didn't blow in North Europe, and etc. So you have those weather issues that certainly played a role. But then you have a longer-term issue, which basically kind of answers, in a sense, Ottaviano's, or relates to Ottaviano's question for the energy transition, that we had, if I could call, underinvestment, so to speak, in the fossil fuel industry in general, especially coal, and I would say oil in particular. So you have underinvestment because of pressures in response to energy transition. And with this underinvestment, on top of this underinvestment, we had the short-term weather issues and geopolitical issues, etc. And that's why we had the upward pressure on those 2 fuels, and it spread over to oil recently. One metric that I like to use, and I did not use in my presentation, is the following. which also points to Gian's point about the movement of commodity prices, is that this, or rather last year in 2021, we had a huge increase in crude oil going for electricity generation. I don't know the exact number. It's when I checked it, it was certainly more than 500,000 barrels per day. It may have been close to 1 million barrels per day. Now this is the highest, or perhaps the highest since the 1970s. And that's in response to the fact that we had high prices for coal and natural gas. So that's different now. So we have now, what we see now, we have an across the board increase in energy prices, which by definition makes it more permanent. Centrally something which goes beyond, it's going to go beyond a year. And of course, we have the geopolitical issues that came on top of that. So the short answer to Uri's question is that, and perhaps Marie-Louise's question is that, yes, we may be entering in a period of high energy prices, and energy transition has to do a lot with it. The fact that meaning the industry did not invest as much because of the obvious reasons. And one issue that I would also like to highlight in the energy transition is that we thought that we had a transition fuel, so to speak, and that was natural gas. So the idea of the energy transition is that we move away from coal first and gradually from crude oil and to renewable energy sources, and the natural gas will aid us throughout this transition. What it turned out to be the case is that even natural gas may not be as a reliable energy transition fuel. So the short answer to your questions is that we may be heading for higher energy price both in the short term and in the long term, and centrally we may be facing high volatility. So that's my view, and the geopolitical issues lately are going to add more fuel to this this fire. On inflation, or rather on which countries, the second Uri's question, on which countries are most vulnerable to the inequality issue. Now, when it comes to grains, oil seeds, and food imports, I think the MENA region, which stands for North Africa and Middle East, is probably the region most exposed to shocks in food, price shocks in food markets. And a lot of those countries have direct links, trade imports from the Central Asian countries. So those are probably the countries that are going to pay the higher prices if food prices stay high in the medium term. In terms of inequality, we can look at the lower income end of the spectrum, the low income countries. And the simple reason is because in those countries, a large share of expenditures by households go directly to food. By some accounts, probably as much as 50 or 60% goes for food expenditures. So if we have high food prices, those are the countries or the portions of the population that are going to pay the higher price. So in terms of inequality, the short answer to your question, or in terms of inequality, we are going to see issues in low-income countries, and in terms of regional distribution, probably MENA is the region that's going to be affected the most. Now, in terms of food price inflation, yes, we did see increase in food price inflation across the board, both in developed and high income and EMDs. I'm sure that this is going to continue. And the reason is that it's not only that we have high food prices globally, we also have high energy prices. So regardless of whether you are a food importer or a food exporter, for as long as you pay higher prices for crude oil, for natural gas, for fertilizer, that's going to affect the cost of food prices. So food price inflation is going to continue to be high. And we also have the other risk on the pandemic, which we did not discuss much, depending on how much it extends in those countries and whether we're going to have a new variant. We also may have sort of other supply chain issues, which may add even more to food price inflation. So the short answer to the question of food price inflation, my sort of forecast is that we're going to see high food price inflation across the board, across all countries. So those were the short answers to your question. I will be glad to elaborate even more. But again, the biggest question, the longer term question or issue is what was mentioned by Ottaviano, is the energy transition, and that may play a big role, not only in the energy markets, but also in food commodity markets.
Okay, John. Let me ask back my colleagues' discussants if you want to add anything, want to react, or want to make any question, or...
Ottaviano, can I come in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, come in.
You know, I'm very concerned about actually this relationship of higher coal and energy and gas prices, which, as John mentioned, as I understand it, is historically unusual. From my experience, it's kind of the oil price has been the driving factor typically, and the rest kind of follow in synchrony with natural gas prices having a much more local response because of the nature of the logistics. So a much more varied response. And now what we are seeing is that in a sense the gas prices we know have become somewhat more global because of the LNG, and the coal prices are reacting very strongly. And there's a debate out there of how much this is due to the energy transition. And I've seen people, now John is seeing it as related to the energy transition. To me, that was always and is a very logical interpretation of what's going on. I mean, after all, you know, there is so much effort and so many initiatives being put forward that are signaling to all market players that the days for these commodities are numbered. And since the investment required the kind of delay of between investment and output in a lot of these situations is extremely long, it just makes a lot of common sense that if market participants have become convinced that this is a real trend, that they will invest less. And they are saying that they will invest less. And this is occurring against a background where the renewable resources are just not coming on stream in nearly the same speed. And indeed, in some highly sophisticated countries, like Japan, for example, it's kind of the message is, you know, we don't really believe in that these can work for us in the short term or in the, you know, right now or even in the next several years. And then on top of this, now you have this huge shock which is coming. I think we should not underplay it. Now that it is a full-scale invasion, and I had a lot of doubts about whether that would happen actually until it happened. It just seems such an irrational thing. Now that we have a full-scale invasion, this is going to have a huge effect on gas and oil in particular. So you kind of have this overlay, and I can imagine history books being written 20 years from now that say, well, this was the perfect storm of 2022, you know, the combination of the underlying structural changes in the markets which have led to a fundamental imbalance. Yeah, the renewables are not here. They're not as effective as we had hoped, et cetera, for various reasons. And the fossil fuels, on the other hand, we're underinvesting in fossil fuels. And then comes this massive shock from the outside against a background where already we have very strong inflationary pressures. So you could paint a picture here that we're looking at a repeat of 1973, 1975, of course, under different, in quite different circumstances, but sort of, well, actually, an even better analogy would be the oil shock of, 1981, 82, which came when inflation was already high. If that's the case, we've got a very serious problem on our hands. I hope it's not the case. I hope that, I don't quite know how to say it. I hope that the war is short and not bloody. But if this thing persists and then is followed, which is very likely, by the way, by protracted sanctions, and now the United States has put the investors in Nord Stream 2 under sanctions. Now that'll have long-term effects on the supply of gas, very direct long-term effects. It's very worrisome on the impact on the global economy. And then when I hear John speak about all the connections between energy and food, then the impact on poverty, the impact on political stability in a lot of places is going to be considerable.
Yeah. Thanks, Uri. Gas as a transition input is under peril, and the implications may be really bad. And then thanks, John, for making the call about the need to have global vaccination, which has been highlighted by the institutions, and we should not keep that. The necessity of moving ahead with the global vaccination is of the essence, as you mentioned, for the COVID side of the whole thing. And also, it's several because typically, while commodity-rich countries, natural resource-rich countries, have high expectations of having the renewal of the period of a high commodity price, fact of the matter that for all that we saw, what is happening, if any kind of period of high price now, is not for good reasons. It's only for bad reasons, including the challenges on the energy transition. Well, this has been, in my view, a fantastic combination of a very good presentation by John. We are out of time, in fact. And also the inputs and discussions made by Uri, Marie-Louise, and Jen also helped us a lot. And let's hope, as Uri has said, that the expected negative impacts of the ongoing events and the events themselves are not as deep as it is possible to come. I want to thank you all for your contribution here, and let's take stock sometime ahead on what lies ahead with respect to commodity markets, climate transition, and peace. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice.